I'm presenting Blimpy, an artistic framework for creating a spatial augmented reality experience with helium blimps. My name is Martin Froehlich. I'm a senior research associate at the Immersive Art Space, part of the Zurich University of the Arts in Switzerland. Let me quickly introduce you to my team. There is Max Kriegleder, robotics and drone specialist from the ETH Zurich, Serena Cangiano, a researcher at SUPSI in Lugano, Joel Gäwiller, interaction designer and former research associate here at the university, and Roman Jurt, industrial designer and specialist in rapid prototyping and 3D fabrication. I've been involved in spatial augmented reality for the last 7 years. I've developed a software specific for solving the problem of wrapping moving objects in space with video content, with multiple projectors, with very low latencies. This paper or this presentation is structured in 3 parts. I quickly introduce you to the framework, then I show you a video with impressions, and then I talk about our motivation to create such a framework. It all started with an idea from Serena Cangiano, or the observation that it's actually quite easy to build your own helium balloons. And that's actually true if you find the right foil for this purpose. In our case, it had to be, I had to meet specific specifications. It had to be obviously able to hold helium, which requires the foil to be very dense. It has to be very light. It had to be very diffuse, or as diffuse as possible, so we don't have too much shiny or spectral spots on it. And ideally, it had to be white, so we can actually project on it. We finally found an Italian balloon producer that provided us with ample foil that allows us now to explore and experience different kind of shapes and helium drones at our leisure. But a helium drone is not just a helium balloon, it also requires motors or servos. Here is a motor fixture Roman Jurt designed. It's printed with a 3D printer within a few minutes. It's super lightweight, so we can easily attach 6 of those fixtures onto the drone in order to control it totally autonomously. We also needed a controller, a custom-made controller. This one here is the second version. We can control up to 6 motors, up to 6 servos. We also can connect a LED strip in case we don't want to project onto the drone. It has a built-in battery charger and load control. And very neat, we have a Bluetooth configuration tool built in, which allows us to configure the whole controller through a simple tool, and there's no need to upload the firmware every time we make changes to the setup. The architecture is fairly simple. We have the manager, which is a Python script at the center of the architecture. It gets data from the motion capture system. This provides the manager with the position of the blimps. It gets control information from applications to tell the manager where the blimp has to be. And then the manager is sending specific messages to the controller on how the motors have to be engaged in order to get to this position. The motion capture system also sends the tracking data to the spatial augmented reality application, which is responsible for mapping video onto the blimps. The applications, they can be of any sorts depending on the kind of function we want the blimps to have. Now I quickly go and start the video. We started with some commercial products we found online, and we also bought helium balloons and attached spare parts from remote controlled airplanes. We rented this professional helium drone to get some inspiration for our design. And here you see the process of creating a helium balloon. We first fix the foil with hot glue, then solder it together, fill it with helium. And we need to attach the motor fixture onto the balloon, attach the motor to the controller, and we can fly the helium balloon. If you want to watch this video at your own leisure, you can find it under this URL. And now let's go to the last point, the motivation. The immersive art space is an entity of disciplinary kind at the University of the Arts. It serves as a research, teaching and production platform and is accessible to all departments of the university, which gives it a bit of special status. Projected augmented reality is one of the main research focus here at the space, and being able to research with flying objects that can be either remotely or even fully automatically controlled gives a new dimension to the problem that needs exploration. But we also have the task to pass on knowledge to the students, ideally in a transdisciplinary context where multiple disciplines from different fields of the university can learn together. And even better if our current research can be experienced firsthand by our students. Blimpy aims to be such a platform where real-time motion capture, projection mapping, Internet of Things, real-time video generation, design, construction, rapid prototyping, programming, networking, and many more topics come together. Such a project cannot be solved by one specialist alone anymore. It needs collaboration, and we hope we have with Blimpy a story that can bring as many different disciplines together as possible to work on all those aspects. By the time this video is aired, we will have conducted our first workshop, and I hope I will be able to give feedback on if our expectations were met. With this, I conclude this presentation. I thank you for your attention. If you want to learn more about the immersive art space, you can find it under this URL, and you can contact me under this email address. Thank you very much.
Hello. The Aeon performance system is presented by Miles Thorogood and Aleksandra Dulic from the University of British Columbia. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which this presentation is recited is the unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan peoples. The Aeon instrument is an expressive visual music tool used for live media to support interdisciplinary performance practice. The Aeon instrument enables generative animation, editing, and compositing tailored for improvisation expression of projected visual elements and spatialized audio. In this presentation, we discuss the design of Aeon in terms of its conceptual, design, and performative aspects, both in oral and visual domains. Our instrument presents the performer with a large set of techniques that enable flexible media manipulation and generation. The paper also addresses issues related to the tensions between narrative structure and performative expression, live and recorded media, image and sound, and the structuring of improvised media. The creative impulse for dynamic exchange of musical forms and visual language has transcended the limits of media that has inspired computational performance. More specifically, interactive audiovisual performance has developed into a significant position within the contemporary art that communicates common aesthetical concerns such as synesthetic composition, computational expression, and the dynamics of performance to enable integrated audiovisual compositions that unfold in real time. The Aeon instrument for live media expression allows assemblage of abstract cinematic experience in the performance context from beginning to end in front of the audience. To contextualize and discuss ideas that emerge from Aeon performances, we bring into the foreground concepts of extending embodied gestures and animation into a live compositional media. We explore a balance of embodied skills, including drawn and painted animation, musical gesture, movement, and so on, with the ability to dynamically mediate these in a compositional media environment. The key question we consider in our work is how to enable the embodied skill of practitioners to be integrated with computational processes available through the use of software designed for interactive multimedia performance. This objective allows us to produce rich hybrid performances integrating interactive animations and electroacoustic sound. The computational media provides opportunities to explore novel production and artistic ideas through live interaction and the diffusion of audible and visible images in an expanded space and across organized time. This flexible approach presents a key compositional challenge that requires a transformation of the methods of scored and montage linear media into a flexible time-based interactive and improvisational strategies. To overcome the challenge of integrating and synchronizing various performance elements, such as recorded media, instrumental music, and live animation, we have developed computational techniques that can aid the expressiveness of performance within a larger multidisciplinary ensemble. The Aeon visual system. The visual performance system provides a variety of inputs, an encoded procedural section which can be functionally divided into three areas of voicings of visual material: heterographic, composite, and generative, and a section that supports the diffusion of multiple channels of video display. Heterographic voices are composed of a series of short media elements designed as a family of animated gestures that work together to create a more complex animation. Each animated gesture is equivalent to a note or phrase in a musical score. These animated voices are like musical gestures, short and compact, and can be layered together across visual and temporal space. The composite voicing enables layering of media streams and processes that are normally associated with the non-real-time context of film and video post-production. Compositing, editing, and sequencing are made available to the performer for real-time manipulation. Complex compositing arrangements are saved as scenes and compositions which can be called anytime during the performance. Once the scene is activated, it can be further manipulated and modulated in a performance context. Generative voices have the capacity to produce original material, sequence, and animate pre-existing media and behaviors, as well as analyze, transform, and map the real-time input coming from performer. The expressiveness of the instrument is enabled by gestural control over visual parameters driven by input from the performers. Here, the critical design consideration is in striking a balance between the degrees of improvisational freedom and the specificity of control parameters. The visual animation modules, at the low level, generate vectors, colors, characteristics, scale, positions, points, lines, and planes. The medium-level animation modules operate at the object level that encompasses both shape and movement. Mid-level objects generate data such as shape, volume, position, direction, texture, application, and the modification of their form, and so forth, and so on. The animated objects include modules such as textured vector shapes, particles, groupings of moving objects, as well as the real-time stop-motion animation that is keyed and displayed in an integrated manner in the three-dimensional space. The high-level modules generate performer-controlled object groupings, time structures, and behaviors such as motion vectors and time-based ornament structures. Generative processes provide what is perhaps the most dynamic relationship between the human performer and the machine. A variety of automatic processes are possible at three levels of image manipulation described previously. The kinds of performer input can take the form of simple mouse clicks and movements within the frame, as well as gestural controls in two-dimensional panels mapped to a variety of parameter spaces. The balance of procedural animation with skilled human input enables a dynamic relationship to a live performed situation. The provision of a set of procedural tools at the various levels of image production for moving image capture, processing, display, allow the performer to control the weaving of computational and compound threads of visual processes in concert with other media threads in the creation of a resulting braid of situated media in performance. The Aeon music system. The software for music system are written in SuperCollider programming environment. The music performance system provides an input from external sources, such as a microphone, and a generative system based on a multi-agent model that learns from the audio input to the system from the performer to build drone and musical gestures. The Aeon music software is a generative music system for augmenting live performance with aesthetics influence from a type of Lamont Young minimalism and the Indian classical drone instrument, the tempura. Similar to these influences, ambient elements, reminiscent of steamworks, structures from silence, long tones and rich textures, and a flow characterize the quality of the generated sound by Aeon. Technically, the system uses a process loosely based on the tape loop technique. This technique, developed in the 1940s by music concrete pioneer Pierre Schaeffer, uses a piece of magnetic audio tape of varying lengths to repeat a recorded sound. Sound is either recorded on the tape loop before a performance or recorded live to be manipulated and processed using available techniques. While the tape loop technique modifies the length of the loop to control the length of the repeated sound, the Aeon music system records a microphone input to a variable sized buffer. Aeon music system manipulates the duration of the sound using a granular synthesis algorithm, allowing flexible control of the parameters. The system has an infinite number of buffers, or tape pieces, available for manipulating and layering, constrained by creative decisions and the available computational resources. As a human-computer interface, a performer controls these parameters as a self-timed performance instrument using a GUI. Building on this control topology, Aeon music system is an electroacoustic system driven by a multi-agent model. In such a model, synthetic agents with certain behaviors interact with an environment to simulate and predict complex phenomena. In this case, the phenomena are the creative control of the recording into a manipulating of the audio buffers to achieve the desired aesthetic result. That is, richly textual and flowy drone music. Each agent is responsible for listening to the input from the microphone to record instruments at moments presented by the performer, and then manipulate a corresponding audio buffer in negotiation with other agents' actions. The elemental composition form of Aeon music system is a cascading cyclic structure, where one agent provides a steady background drone and other agents are either adding to the drone or are designated to play a series of motifs. Agents added to the drone first remove the note onset, and, if a drone already exists, analyze their amplitude and attenuate themselves relative to the fundamental for cohesive layering in the background texture. If the performer specifies an agent as a motif type, then the agent analyzes the audio buffer and logs the onsets, the onset intervals, the timing of the drone cycle, and the pitch of the signal at the onset times. The agent then generates inverted and retrograde variations of the logged onset information and a set of elaborations that are defined by modulating the granular synthesis parameters within the constraints of the overall cyclic structure. Agents designated as a motif then negotiate who is playing which variation and who will play an elaboration when in a given cycle. In the negotiation protocol, a turn-taking behavior designates one agent as a leader who chooses a motif variation and one elaboration. Remaining agents propose a motif variation from their selection, and the leader chooses one of the proposals based on the goodness of fit with the overall compositional structure. The leader repeats this simple action until the list of agents is exhausted. If no proposal gains a score above a threshold set by the performer, then the leader rejects all proposals and plays a solo, cycling through variations and motifs aligned with the drone repetitions. As an integrated collaborative instrument, Aeon Music System generates a range of drones and musical gestures steered by the performer in response to the expressiveness of the instruments recorded. Recording technologies in both music and film eliminated the magic of presence, the power of interaction among performers and audience that happens only during a live performance. Computational aesthetics embedded in a postmodern art practice enables recorded material to be modulated and integrated in a performance art. This new situation enables artists to build new relationships with their audience and respond to the events taking place on the stage. As a performance, this newly conceived film only exists in the presence and exchange of artists and the audience. The improvisation and open form facilitate the thrill of the audience towards the unexpected, the accident, and insight into the creative process, and should be subject each time to reinterpretation and recreation. The Aeon instrument and subsequent performances encapsulate this state of always becoming. In the design of the system, we bring into the foreground concepts of extended embodied gesture and animation into a live computational media, including drawn and painted animation, musical gesture and movement, with the ability to dynamically modulate these in a computational media environment. At its core, Aeon enables the embodied skill of the practitioners to be integrated with the computational process. This objective enables us to produce rich hybrid performances integrating interactive animations and electroacoustic sound. The computational media provide opportunities to explore novel production of artistic ideas through live interaction and the diffusion of audible and visual images in an expanded space and across organized time to aid the expressiveness of performance within a larger multidisciplinary ensemble. Thank you for listening to our presentation.
I'm Bridget Johnson, a Senior Lecturer and Music Technology Coordinator at Massey University in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This presentation will discuss the identification within the field of spatial sound art, whereby we are seeing a re-emergence of the intrigue of physical sound movement. It will discuss the history of spatial sound and how it went through a long development period of virtualization and simulation in creating sound trajectories with stationary loudspeakers. The presentation will then introduce some more recent examples of works where the artists have not simulated spatial sound trajectories, but instead work to physically move sound sources as a spatialization technique. The compositional interest of spatial movement within sound can be seen right throughout history, with examples dating back to cathedral compositions using separated choirs. There are also examples of composers putting instructions in for performers to walk across the stage or through the audience, so the sound would physically change its source location. With the advent of loudspeakers, the sound source itself became fixed. However, composers have still looked to integrate the spread and movement of sound into the work. This started with stereophonic sound and the ability to create phantom source locations. In a phantom source location, the amplitude of two loudspeakers is adjusted in order to simulate a sound source location between the two speakers. From stereo sound, there were further advancements that have led to very sophisticated spatial trajectory capabilities through ambisonics, wavefield synthesis, and binaural sound approaches. In these cases, the goal was always to create spatial trajectories and sound movements within a loudspeaker array that could be perceived by the audience, while the sound sources were, of course, static. As advancements in understanding human psychoacoustics took place, we began to understand that the human ear is more concerned with perceived power and intensity of a sound, rather than pure amplitude changes. With this knowledge, spatialization techniques began to incorporate spectral filtering and reverberation changes, alongside amplitude difference, which heightened the ability to simulate complex spatial movement within audio playback. These techniques have been used within electroacoustic composition, but also in popular music, and more recently, significant advances have taken place in the creation of immersive experiences for augmented reality, virtual reality, and mixed reality. With the removal of the loudspeaker system and instead the audio experience being delivered through headphones, the virtualization of spatial movement in audio has become very convincing to the listener. Alongside the development of spatialization algorithms and techniques, the democratization of home computing meant that digital art has become integrated into many fields within music in a much broader context. However, with many decades of virtualization and digitization of art forms, we can now recognize an emerging trend where artists and audience members alike are drawn back to the power of a curated interaction with physical elements. In some ways, the more advanced the simulation capabilities become, the more interesting it is to present the same information in a physical form. The resurgence of musical robotics is a prime example of this phenomenon, where physical gestures made by musical machines have become an important visual element used for musical expression. This resurgence of the physical can also be recognized within spatial sound art. This presentation will now go on to look at a few examples of artworks that have successfully created physical experiences of moving sound. Within sound installation art, these works fit into two categories: those which use parametric loudspeakers that are highly directional and are directed at reflective objects to move, and those that aim to physically move the loudspeaker itself. First, the pieces using parametric loudspeakers. Relief is a piece from today's art festival in The Hague in the Netherlands in 2017, which uses parametric loudspeakers to create an echo sculpture. The piece features a wall of reflective panels that are at varying angles and an array of ultrasonic hyperdirectional loudspeakers pointed at these reflective panels. The hyperdirectionality of the speakers means that when the sound from the speakers hits the panels, it bounces in different ways based off the angles. In this work, the visual and physical nature of the panels and their varying angles helps audience members to experience the complex spatial nature of the audio and draw meaning to the piece's echolocation themes. The ultrasonic loudspeakers ensure that it is the second-order reflections of the audio that are perceived by the listener instead of their point source. Therefore, the reflective panels themselves become the focal point. A further piece using parametric loudspeakers is Spatial Reflections, a 2018 piece featured in the Aotearoa Audio Arts Festival in Wellington, New Zealand. This work uses loudspeakers to direct sound at panes of glass that are hung throughout the space and slowly rotate. As the sound hits the glass, it is then reflected based off the angle at the time throughout the room. As there were 3 panes of glass all rotating at slightly different speeds, sometimes a sound would ricochet between multiple pieces of glass and create even further complexity in the spatial trajectories. The composition in spatial reflections includes rhythmic noise bursts, which are easy for humans to localize, and draws the listener's attention to the second and sometimes third and fourth order reflections. The composition also includes some drone elements made of sine tones that encourage a point source location but are localized to the first pane of glass that the sound interacts with. To the listener's ears, this gives the impression that the glass itself is emanating the sound. I will now give examples of works that physically move a loudspeaker in order to create spatial variation. Speaker Motion is a mechatronic loudspeaker system developed by myself in order to allow the direction and tilt of a loudspeaker to be dynamically adjusted to change the sound trajectory. Unlike the previous two pieces, Speaker Motion refers to the loudspeaker system itself. A number of works have been composed and performed with this system. The Speaker Motion system uses MIDI messages to individually control the direction, tilt, and rotational speed of each loudspeaker in real time. Speaker Motion allows real-time rotation and tilting of the loudspeaker. The next piece discussed also uses mechanical actuators to create motion. However, the motion takes place across a linear plane. Like Speaker Motion, 5 moving speakers uses the physical movement of the loudspeaker in order to create spatial trajectories instead of doing this through virtual panning or spectral filtering. The audience receives the visual cues to further the translation of this intent through the creative work. 5 moving speakers places the speaker cones on a linear rail system that can then move each of the cones with a timing belt and stepper motor. In all of the pieces discussed, the visual cues that the audience receives by seeing an object physically move to direct sound, whether it be the loudspeaker itself or a reflective panel, are a key part of the audience engagement. The works discussed have all achieved this physicality of spatial audio in different ways, and thus provided new and engaging experiences for audience members. As with many fields of art currently experiencing substantial advancements in their ability to convincingly depict real-world experiences by virtual means, there continues to be a drive by artists to achieve something more physical and visual, and to use this to help audience members connect with an experience that cannot be seen. Thanks for listening. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out, and I look forward to seeing the other presentations of the conference.
D'ailleurs, qui est pas très facile avec y penser la journée.
Jeremy, I think we are live now.
Okay. I have a question for all the panelists. What most interests you in trajectory and movement in relation to aesthetics? It applies to all of your work. Would anyone like to tackle that? You have moving sound, moving graphics in relation to performance. You have projection mapping on blimps, which are moving objects. What do you find most interesting about that combination?
I'm happy to jump in there. So I think for me, with my work in sound movement, what's really interesting about it is that sound movement, moving sound is very much how we experience this in the real world. So we almost never hear stationary sounds. They're actually always moving around us at any given point. And I find that in a lot of artworks, when sound is stationary, it can lose the kind of connection to the real world, especially if we're talking about sort of sampling sounds for the environment. You know, a bee, for example, sounds really different if it doesn't move, because a bee is always on the move. So I'm really interested in kind of how that real world experience and our natural bringing of the real world into everything that we experience in the art world can kind of merge together to create something for the audience that allows them to kind of connect to reality, but to disconnect to reality through the artwork at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and can be approached on in a number of different levels. From the idea of storytelling. Storytelling is a place where we often experience a journey or a quest. There's a beginning and end, and maybe things happen in between. Of course, in an infinite game, there's not necessarily an endpoint. So it's how do you keep that journey and that experience of moving and becoming to be persistent. If we think about the idea of spiritual quests or journeys as well, where we start from some place, we have this ritual, this sensation, maybe a shared experience, maybe a personal ritual, and we come out the other end, to continue, but somehow changed. So part of the goal in the aesthetic is to create some kind of change in the experience of an audience. Within music, conversation, where we have people connecting and journeying together, involves a kind of a movement. There's a communication, there's a backwards and forward, there's a journey, there's an exploration, and these take into account the idea of time.
I guess what motivated me to engage myself with spatial augmented reality was breaking out of the screen. At the beginning of my media art studies, I did lots of generative computer works, and then I started to be frustrated by the screen, or by the flat screen, even projected screen. And that's when I started to get into the space. I wanted to get into the real world, and as soon as you go into the real world, trajectories are just part of that. You start to have to deal with the positioning of objects, and then start to think about how do I deal with moving objects and keep on projecting on them. In my case,
I think Martin brings up an interesting question for the other panelists. What of your earlier works and interests has kind of cross-pollinated into what you're looking at and working on now?
Well, for me, I guess I cut my teeth on bushdoofs in the outback of Australia, where we would create these spaces where people would get together and have a shared experience. And so it was interesting for me about what is the connection between the actions I'm taking as a sound artist and the the spaces that are being created to facilitate these transcendental kinds of experiences for people that chose to be involved in that. And so these kinds of abstract psychological spaces are kind of like the cornerstone of where I take my point of departure in work about thinking about where to provide a landscape or an oral space, a soundscape for people to join in with the transcendental experiences that art can facilitate.
Yeah, I think for me, I actually got into this sort of creation of mechatronic loudspeakers and things like that through the practice of sound diffusion, and I got really interested in developing interfaces for sound diffusion, and I actually had built a number of sort of iPad apps and large-scale tabletop applications that were 100% about synthesizing a kind of moving sound trajectory image and trying to create some way for the audience to see that that was what I was doing as a performer. But what I found was, you know, I'd got away from using a mixing desk where, you know, my gesture is up and down, but the output of that gesture is a sort of left-right movement. And so I was, you know, my physical gestures were more in tune with the sonic output, but the audience still didn't really get that. And so at a certain point I started thinking, well, what if I stopped trying to simulate that a sound was moving from the left to the right, and what if I actually just made the sound move from the left to the right? So it sort of all kind of came for me through exploring, you know, interface development and developing tools for my own performance practice, and kind of not being happy with what existed in the tools that I was building, and kind of being like, hang on a second, you know, what if I just actually did what I'm trying to do instead of pretending to do what I'm trying to do? And that's how a lot of these tools that I've been working on lately have kind of come about.
Nice, nice. All right, next question. What do you find the relationship can be in your work and your research to quote new technologies and concepts and quote older concepts and technologies? I can go a little further on that. Blimps is something that, you know, older aerospace technology. Sound modulation's been around for a while, as in your research. Audio visualization and performance has older versions of it, but you've taken it new places. How do you see that in your process? Muted. And I know it's good too.
Oh, I'm sorry for that.
Oh, okay.
I muted myself. You know, sorry. Okay. Now I'll try to give some audio feedback as well. In my case, it's more like about the combination and playing around technologies and combining technologies and see how these combinations can come up with new emergent aesthetic results that could be used for artistic explorations. So I don't really see. I mean, we are standing anyway on the shoulder of giants, and we're using tools and knowledge that has been around and has been developed by other people. I don't feel intimate. I don't have a problem with that. And I mean, all I can do is see if I can come up with a new combination that maybe has some little bit of novelty in it.
Very good. Sounds good.
I was always inspired by Paul Clay's quote, "One day I must be able to improvise on a keyboard of colors," which is a lovely idea for abstract painters of the turn of the century. And computation allows us to bring the painting and sound and movement into the new performative domain. And this is not a new idea. We've been doing this kind of performance for last maybe 15, 20 years, but it's really lovely to be able, as a visual artist, to participate in that kind of direct performance. So clearly, that idea is as old as shadow plays and, you know, moving shadows and around the caves. But yeah,
Yeah, I would say for me also it's sort of about being quite inspired by concepts that have been around for a long time. Like one thing that I often think of, with the speaker motion work, for example, is, Stockhausen actually hanging a loudspeaker and off some wire and swinging it around and then trying to record that sort of spatial trajectory. So I think, and another example would be for my work, Trevor Wishart's sort of drawings of his, like in his On Sonic Art book. He draws all of these spatial trajectories and discusses the meaning that they might embed within music if we were able to move sound around like that. So what I really see my role as is kind of going, well, in 2020, I have access to develop the technology to allow us to achieve these spatial concepts that people have been kind of talking about and imagining for quite some time. And now we're at a position where we can start to move forward on being able to go, oh, well, this is what that actually does, and this is what it actually embeds within music. And I know that now because I've tried it and I've sat in the room and listened to it, and I've performed it, and others have sat in the room to listen to it. So it's sort of about being quite inspired by some of these more traditional trajectories and sound art practices, but marrying those with what we're now actually able to achieve with the new technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree a lot with that. The idea of when new tools and instruments are created, they empower and elevate the creative potential of human beings to the next epoch or the next level, allow us to explore what it means to be human and in the world and the world around us in new ways. And so technology, and as we develop that, we're sort of creating and facilitating these spaces to be able to afford us to find new ways of creating and exploring the world.
Awesome. Okay, next question. Oh no.
I forgot again to unmute myself. I think that the one common ground we all have is we all are tool makers of a kind, and I think we all create. I probably can only speak for myself, but I prefer to create tools that allow to open up new ways of experiences or new ways of creating experiences, and I'm only aiming for this kind of experiences I can vaguely imagine, but I have to really create the tools in order to get to the point to explore them and experience them myself or with the help of others.
And there is an interesting question you bring, because the question is, how do we learn how to be master performers on instruments that keep changing all the time? Because every new instrument brings new performative challenges.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, this is a problem I'm very well aware of. And, yeah, basically, I mean, how do you convince the next Mozart to learn how to create or compose a music piece for this new tool before actually anybody has actually figured out what you could do with this tool?
Right.
So it's kind of catch-22, right?
Right. Like I think it's interesting that the first definition of avant-garde was actually a military term. And if you imagine the military going in rows, that poor drummer and that poor flag bearer, that was the front line. So that was the avant-garde, was just the first to play with the new tool. So the next question, what are you most drawn to as far as aesthetics in relation to sound or motion and sound in your work?
I think in my case, they have to fit somehow. So it has to be a synesthetic experience. I think if sound and visuals they match together, they are enhancing each other, and and somehow you can feel that, but it's really hard to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes even breaking with that and creating surprise. So if we hear within a soundscape the sound of an aeroplane, but it's coming from below our feet, then we're have an expectation and we have a response to that. In the case, it's a surprise, and that surprise can be pleasant or unpleasant, or positively or negatively balanced kind of emotive affect. And so playing with that element of surprise with the matching of sound and emotion, movement, position is a place of opportunity.
Yeah, I'm really interested also in how the performance space or installation space, depending on the type of work, how that kind of plays into the aesthetics as well. Like for example, if I present a sound while the loudspeaker's pointed at a pane of glass, how might that be different if I present the same sound, but point the loudspeaker at the roof or that type of thing? And so I'm quite fascinated myself in how the site specificity of any room or any kind of venue might kind of play into the aesthetics. And one of the reasons that I'm really interested in keeping as much as possible from a spatial perspective happening in real time is so that I can kind of think of myself not only as jamming, with the sound or with the timbre or the rhythm or other aspects of the music making process, but also with the space and how, the audience might, the space that we're in has embedded meaning always. And so that becoming a kind of interesting part of the compositional process and the performance process, I think is like one of the area or the kind of aesthetics within sound performance that I'm pretty interested in at the moment.
How would you say, I'm trying to think exactly how to construct this question. How would you say error or glitch or the negative aspect, or not negative, but the uncertainty principle, like us being on streaming right now, how does that relate to your work in terms of the performative, in terms of the way that it cross balances technologies and forms? Is that part of what interested you, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's actually, one of the most exciting parts of getting to be an artist in many ways. And again, with Speaker Motion, I've kind of, coming from a sort of sound engineering and production and composition kind of background, it was always about like, I have to find the right acoustics for this piece. This piece can only be listened to in this perfect environment. And now with Speaker Motion, I just don't believe in perfect acoustics. I believe in interesting acoustics. And the whole idea is that I would kind of improvise and play with sort of whatever I get. And I think that there's something inherent in this kind of improvisational or kind of call and response, within the art of music making, which, whether that be live stream or recording or however it is, being able to adapt and respond in real time, I think is a big part of what we do, for sure.
Yeah, the idea of serendipity within performance context is a useful one to bring up, where every performance and every new iteration of a project carries with it its own kinds of sets of affordances, towards wins and failures and different kinds of experiences, not only for the participants but also for the performers themselves. There's a really great quote by Australian sound sculptor Ros Bandt in her book Australian Sound Sculpture that talks about how that the recorded media, whether it's CD or print or video, can never fully describe the experience of the sound making event or object itself as of being there. So the idea of the mistake and the accident or the fluidity of the real corporeal world comes into play at each iteration of any kind of music performance, sound experience.
So the theorist Jalal Tawfiq was, when I was at Cal Arts, he was at a presentation of film and video and photography, and he brought up a point that I'm curious what your thoughts are. It was being recorded by a camera. This is back in the 90s. And he said, turn that damn thing off. And everyone turned and goes, what is he talking about? He said, everything is now subservient to that machine. Everything that's happening now that's live and unpredictable and uncertain is now subject to that recording, and it won't be the same. It was almost like the hierarchy was flipped, which was an interesting point. What do you think about with your work? Is it to be truly experienced live, or how does it change when it's recorded and shown?
I just remember talking with Pierre Hébert, who is a Montreal animator, and him describing performing live on the film strips, and his film strips burning out. And it's we did one time forehand improvisation with two animated elements live, and it's really lovely to be able to express visual. Maybe if you are outside and creating a landscape painting, you directly process and channel all the connectivity and nature and so on, but it's really lovely to be able to do that in the context of live performance and audience, and it's a certainly unique experience. Because it allows you a level of alignment, for sure, and that's unpredictable because you don't know what the environment will bring.
Mm-hmm.
It's exciting.
Anybody else? Or
yeah, I would say in some ways it just doesn't. It's not actually something that I consider super deeply or feel like is that big of a deal one way or another. I think I definitely have an idea going into a piece, whether I'm composing or developing the piece for a kind of real-time context or non-real-time context or kind of recorded medium. But, often when I, maybe initially sketch out a piece and I think of it one way and then I hear it the other way and go, oh, hang on a second, it's actually better like that. Or so I just personally in my art, I try to actually not really worry too much about that, because I think there's merit in these different ways of experiencing their works. That might mean something to one audience member live, it might mean something else to another audience member in a recorded context.
Right.
And I think in 2020, living in New Zealand, in a small island in the South Pacific that's now very cut off from the rest of the world, I think that it's an interesting time to question some of those things that we used to hold on to, like, do I always need to perform live, or does it actually is it a lot more accessible if I make peace with something not being live or that type of thing. So I think it's kind of myself, I'm trying to actually not get too worried about that type of thing at the moment and let the piece kind of make some of those decisions for me, if that makes any sense.
Well, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, I like to work with my computer, but when it comes to my art, I actually prefer the 3D, the physical. Yeah, this is not really my medium. This telecommunication thing, or video recordings or video documentations. My art pieces are usually very badly documented in this sense.
Mm-hmm. This is for Aleksandra and Miles, but also anyone else that wants to jump in. What has been the influence of synesthesia or synesthesia-like concepts in your work, especially the multisensory combination?
Very recently, it's going back to Paul Klee and Kandinsky. They've done lots of theorizing about the relationship between the sound and image and the synesthetic potential. You know, the question of how the form comes to being, how the form expresses itself in the audio and visual and other sensory domains. So I can say definitely on that level, the writings of Paul Klee and Kandinsky were very influential in terms of understanding the possibilities of synesthetic experience, especially in the context of abstract art, because it's more direct, non-representational, and it works directly on your senses without trying to conceptualize it in a representational way. You?
I think the connection between different modalities of senses has a way of creating very immersive spaces for heightened kinds of experience. And so these kinds of synesthetic media creations are sort of a wider band to be able to create immersive affect in viewers and listeners. To get to that space of, wow, this is really interesting, kind of like a personal journey and experience, feeling when watching, listening, touching, smelling.
I don't know. I think most of us don't experience synesthesia. I think it's only a few people that actually experience it. Say you hear something and you get a visual effect on it, or the other way around. But it's quite obvious that when you have a piece of art that combines different modalities in a very specific way that seems to fit perfectly. I don't know if you can call that synesthesia. It seems to be a synesthetic effect, but it seems to be something that hasn't got a name yet. It is related to this effect, but it's actually something that anybody can experience, while the synesthesia is actually only, I think only a few of us can actually experience it. And yes, but it's high artistry, and I'm not capable of doing it, to be honest.
I think, now that I think, but I do have the visual sensory domain, sometimes visual responses to sonic and other events. So, but in terms of, as you said, the theory of, I think Kandinsky was also synesthetic, and which was a big inspiration for his work and the way one uses color and shapes for expression.
Yeah, I worked on a special issue of Leah out of MIT Press years ago, and my co-editor, she had synesthesia, and she had worked on the color organ, if you're familiar with that. So, I wish I had synesthesia. I did a work of sound that was me trying to imagine the images, but anyway, I'm your moderator, so enough about that.
Yes. That was Kandinsky spent his lifetime trying, well, a lifetime or some time attaching trying to align the color and the shape and the sound and find relationships and explain the phenomena.
Yeah, I think
the form, right?
I think we could all agree that there's a lot of works in art where you try to find something somewhat synesthetic. And I agree with Martin. There needs to be a term. I don't think there is one, but that approach and trying to have a multi-sensorial work is definitely something that is to try to achieve. I have a weird question now. I hope it makes sense. So the cybernetic organism, people think of like something out of science fiction, and they go, oh, it's like RoboCop, blah, 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 blah. But it's been argued that a person emailing or now texting is a cybernetic organism because the text or email couldn't be sent without the person. The person couldn't do it without the smartphone. So in that sense, what do you think the relationship is between you, code, and machine in your work for each of you? What's the balance that you think you have that you're playing with?
Yeah, I guess I kind of try to think of you know, the code or you know, any of the kind of mechanisms that I'm working with quite purely as tools, because I think the conceptual idea you know, is human in its sort of start, and what comes out the other end in its art form is also in my work made for a human experience, and so you know, in some ways for me, I don't really think of the tools that I'm developing or you know, the code that I'm writing or the computer that I'm using as any different from, you know, if I was playing the violin. Like it just is this middle ground that allows me artistically to say what it is that I want to say and get that, you know, from me to the audience. But in saying that, that's kind of, I think, how I view those things. You know, they are, if I look at my artistic practice, you know, I spend, I couldn't even estimate 300 hours developing a tool and probably 2 hours, you know, making music with the tool at the end.
Right.
So whilst I kind of don't like to hyperanalyze it as anything other than, you know, a form of communication that allows you know, the expression to come from me and end up with the audience, it is, you know, 90% at least, if not a lot more, of what I'm actively engaging with. So I don't know if that actually changes the meaning in any way, but I think it's a kind of interesting thing to think about.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Martin? I have a question for you, Martin, too.
Well, I try to come up with an answer to your question. I think your was it your colleague who came up with? I think your colleague is correct. I mean, but simply because Homo sapiens is a tool maker, and it has been a tool maker since he invented fire. Mm-hmm. And since he invented fire and words, we are swimming in these tools, and our consciousness is completely and is shaped by those tools. And we are shaping those tools, and this is like the water a fish is swimming in. We're not thinking. If we were a fish, we would not think about the water. We would just say, it's there. This is it. I mean, what's water? I don't know what water is because I'm swimming in it. You only can perceive water once you get out of the water, or you change from salt water into sweet water. But I mean, how do you do that as a consciousness? How do you step outside of this culture of tools we are living and engaging ourselves in? So yes, I'm a consciousness swimming in this water called technology, and I'm being shaped by it, and I'll try to shape it as good as I can. In a way that I think hopefully drives humanity into a positive path.
Oh, nice. I like your analogy. It's like the mullet in the 80s was just a haircut.
I have a question for you, Martin. Well, what would be the difference between the tool and an instrument? I've been thinking about that a lot, because once you add the layers of expression and complexity, it gets to become an instrument in some ways. So yeah, what's your take on that? Are we building tools or instruments?
Well, I define myself as an inventor of things humanity hasn't been asking for. And the reason for that is because I prefer to invent things, and then after I invent them, I can decide this is an art piece, or this is a tool, or it is an instrument. And yes, there is a difference between a tool and an instrument.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously an instrument is a tool, but an instrument is obviously made for making art. Or an instrument is a tool for making art. It's a tool to open new realms of perception, I think. That's what an instrument is. And obviously it needs an artist in order to use this tool in order to be able to actually achieve this. And I might be, and I guess you guys also, as far as I can see, you are certainly instrument makers. I certainly am not the artist to play this instrument. I'm just instrument maker. Hopefully it's an instrument. Maybe it's just a tool. I'm not sure.
Well, that, the relationship, the previous question that went on the relationship between the code and creation. Of course, clearly some of the instruments we can create with these days are enabled by the code, and that's unique, and it keeps growing and developing. But yeah.
I love the saying, a bell is a cup until it's struck.
Right.
I could see that. So, so Martin, direct question. I could ask it to you in a more academic way, but also ask you directly. Why blimps and why Nemo?
Well, yeah, just well, I was interested in spatial augmented. I'm interested in spatial augmented reality, so projecting of moving things in the world, and being able to project onto objects that actually can fly is more interesting than being able to project on objects that just stand on the ground. Even though there can be interesting objects that stand on the ground as well, and then we are approaching this problem too here in our lab. And Nemo, he was just a character that somebody decided to create a toy, and we used the toy to explore what. I mean, I've been developing lots of technology in the last 15 years, and sometimes I reinvented the wheel, and I prefer not to reinvent the wheel anymore. I prefer to learn from other people and stand on previous achievements. So we just took those toys and disassembled them and looked what they did right and what they did wrong, and then we just took the things that we thought we can use, and that's why Nemo was part of the process.
Nice. I found it really interesting because I've seen a lot of image wrapping and mapping, but not on a moving object. So a lot of works are buildings, etc. So you took it to a moving object, which is interesting. I have a question now for Bridget, or anyone else that wants to jump into this. What is it about modulation of sound that interests you, both in the history that you talked about and your project?
Yeah, I think for me, I feel that like spatial modulation is like something that I want to say like take for granted, but I don't feel like that's quite the right phrase. But I think that we're really quick to like analyze sound in these, in those kind of 5 characteristics that we're taught in primary school. It's like, oh, there's pitch, there's there's melody, there's harmony, there's rhythm, there's and we kind of rattle off these things that are within sound, and I always feel that space is like kind of left out of that discussion. But with our space, we can't hear. Like sound actually is, the pressure waves are moving through the air, and no matter no matter what situation we're in, sound is going to change as it comes from its source to its listener. And I feel like that's something that's like really deeply embedded in what we do, but often I almost feel like it kind of got put in this like too hard basket for composers. And I guess I'm like really quite fascinated in the things that we put in that too hard basket, and what if we pulled them out and started being like, nah, this is actually, this could be the core of what we not only experience, but because it's the core of what we experience, should it or could it be the core of what we discuss, or at least kind of put into that same sort of field for discussion about what music is and what sound is, and what we as composers or performers are doing with that. So I guess I've just like always kind of been like, why don't we talk and analyze and perform space in the same way that we talk and analyze and perform rhythm or pitch or timbre? And so then I kind of just started massively nerding out on that and haven't really stopped, to be honest.
Nice. Anybody else, or next question? I'm curious, for everyone in your work, how could you describe your process in determining your final aesthetics that you apply to the constructs that you're working with?
In our case, I would say it's a process of discovery. You try many things, you find something that works, and you follow that thread until it stops working, and then you can shift the direction. It's, as Miles was saying, a constant process of becoming.
Yeah, it's a kind of a optimization, maybe of a kind of like a depth first type search, where you start to travel down here, and where you get to, and it's like, okay, well, we got to here, and there's nothing interesting happening, but when we're back here, it was kind of going well, so you start to explore various branches of possibilities.
And computers are also great for that, because you can explore the large design space and variations, and you can use the computer as a tool to actually explore the design space and pick the directions you want to explore further, so to speak.
Yeah, I like to think of my work as very iterative and cyclic, and think of the act of designing an instrument or whatever, development or whatever, as part of the compositional process. And so I would almost sort of suggest that any piece of music that I make is just where I'm at in that iteration at that given point, because I had to book a show, or I had to do an install, or something happened that made me kind of go, oh, here's where it's at now. But generally through performing, that's when I go, oh, imagine if the tool could actually do this, and I didn't know that it needed to do that until I got on stage with it, which makes version 3.2 or 3.3 or kind of whatever. So I tend to think of that as super iterative, and at any given point in my research, I might have 3 or 4 projects that are all at different stages of that iterative process along the way, and I don't really, I very rarely feel like something is finished, but I'm sure that's why we all kind of keep doing what it is that we do.
Right.
Yeah, I guess in my case, it's more the collaboration. At the moment, I see myself more like a tool or instrument maker. And again, since I don't consider myself the grand artist that I can create the great artwork out of them, I prefer to work with other people that bring other skills with them, and that we can, and in collaboration with them, new works start to appear. And basically whatever appears is what happens. I don't know. I mean, there's no criterion that I would apply on the result.
So Martin, I have a question for you, actually tied to exactly what you just said. You mentioned in your presentation there can be applications to interdisciplinary research and pedagogy. I'm curious if you could expand on that.
Yeah, at the beginning of September, I was able to conduct a 2 weeks workshop with 8 students. There were, I think, four were coming from interaction design, 2 came from stage design, and 2 stage design and 2 industrial design. So quite diverse fields. And the idea was, because we can actually create our own balloons and create our own shapes. That means we have the question to those people that prefer to think in 3D shapes. Since we are having balloons that we are setting in space and project them with light, we have questions on scenography. Since we have a kinetic object that needs motors or servos, or maybe can be combined, maybe it's not just 1 balloon, but 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 balloons connected to each other, and they can move in combination. There are problems of constructive forms. Since we have the ability to move those balloons in an autonomous way, we can start to think about how we want to move them around. Do we want to move them around on a fixed trajectory, or do we want to move them around on a generative path? So what kind of generative path could that be? What kind of algorithm could it be that could move the balloons? So we have these are just a few of those different questions that come up when you start to think about the framework and how you can combine those different questions into a new form, into a new performance, into new scenography. And that's what this framework was basically was built for. It was more built for as an educational platform that helps us in our immersive art space to teach the students all those different technologies that come together in our space. So there's motion tracking, video mapping, 3D audio, but also Internet of Things and all those other topics. And we have a university that has got, I don't know how many, we've got 5 departments. Each department has dozens of institutions that are lots. I mean, we have got music, we've got dance, theater, film, design, all sorts of design, art, and one of the problems we have at the university is how do we bring those these disciplines together, because they all live in their own little silo, a silo of tradition of the way they are talking with each other, the language. They have their own languages when they talk about the artwork. They have their own iterative ways of approaching a problem, and all those differences, they actually create quite a big gap. And how do we bring them together and let them engage together on the same question? How do they learn to talk with each other and work together? And this framework was an attempt to help bring those students together and bridge those gaps.
Interesting. Question for Aleksandra and Miles, and again, anyone else that wants to jump in on it. Can you expand a bit more on the relationship in your work to topology?
To what?
You mentioned topology.
Topology. You did?
Yeah, I believe that we did bring up that idea of topology. So the topology would have been in the context of the compositional system. So there's a particular kind of landscape that is there for exploration, which includes the visual elements, and can bring those in and sort of form different combinations with the parameters which are available to the system. And similarly, the multi-agent system, which is driving the Aeon music system, will be looking at the particular space that is available to it, given the audio information that is being fed to it through the performers. And it's the exploration of that space which brings up the various kinds of audio and visual artifacts which make up the multimodal presentation and communication of the performance.
Interesting. So we have 4 minutes left. I have a question for Bridget. And again, if anyone else is interested also. What most interests you in immersive audio and spatialization?
Yeah, I think I'm most interested in like our ability to like create like really complex trajectories. So being able to go for a full spin as opposed to like just a kind of left right pan. And I think we're totally at a point where what we can do with spatial trajectories is pretty endless. Like we can program swarms into these things. We can program kind of flux and ping pongs and sort of all of these algorithms. Take them from natural systems, and the algorithms exist. They're used in visual art. They're used in all sorts of things. And now we can apply that within immersive audio and kind of spatial trajectories as well. And again, I think I kind of mentioned before, like that is actually a much more real world way of experiencing sound. We very much hear sounds flock around us, and we hear sounds kind of spin around us and bounce back and forth. And so I think we're totally at a point where we can actually simulate something that is much closer than we ever have before to the way we actually experience audio in a kind of spatial and 360-degree way. And so I think that's where things are starting to get really quite cool and fun to play with.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone on the panel have a question for another panelist?
I have a question for Martin. I'm like really interested. What is the tool you use to track the motion? And another thing, it seems like you have multiple 360 projection. Like
well, the tool, the tracking tool is a commercial tool that we bought. It's a optical based tracking system, very precise down to the millimeter.
Name?
OptiTrack.
OptiTrack. Okay.
Yeah, it's one of many. There is Vicon. There is, I don't know. There are at least
multiple
four or five. This is just a tracking system. This allows you to track objects in real space.
Yeah.
And then we have normal projectors. These are nothing special about them, except they are a bit more. They've got a bit more light power. And then there's my software, Spark, which is an acronym for Spatial Augmented Reality Construction Kit, which I would call, this is for sure a tool. This is not an instrument, but it's a tool that allows us to map the video content onto the blimps or on any. I mean, and I'm not talking about videos per se. It can also be 3D generated, real-time generated content. So we tend to use also game engines as an output medium and feed that into Spark and project it onto objects. So it's actually quite a versatile tool to map onto to the objects, and that's a tool I developed based on MaxMSP jitter. So it's
So
using
We use Max as well. And okay.
So
Yes. So it's based on Jitter, and it's actually open source as well. I think
What is
there are
it?
links in the
Spark.
paper.
Okay, I'll look for it. Thank you.
So
You're
we've reached our time. Thank you to all the presenters. I think we can keep talking, but I think our channel now finishes. So thank you for your presentations today.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. Thank you.
Lovely to be here.
Glad my Wi-Fi didn't crash.
I want to wait because Martin,